My name is Michael. I'm 52 years old, and 6 months ago my own family decided that my dignity had a price I couldn't afford to pay. As I'm telling you this, my brother is sitting on the floor of a house that no longer belongs to him, wondering at what exact moment his perfect life turned into ashes. It all started with a sentence that still echoes in my ears, delivered with a cynical smile over a glass of expensive wine. "We're sorry, Michael, but we want the wedding to be elegant, and you simply don't have the status or the money to be the best man." My sister-in-law, a woman who hasn't worked a single day in her life, decided that decades of my hard work weren't enough to appear in her Instagram photos. They thought I was the single brother, the quiet one, the hard-working but forgettable man they could step on without consequences. They were wrong. What they didn't understand is that the money I don't brag about is the same money I used to purchase every single one of their debts. That was the day I stopped being the protective older brother and became the architect of their downfall. If you enjoy stories where betrayal has consequences and justice shows up unannounced, hit like and subscribe. Here we share real stories of revenge and lessons no one forgets. For years I was the silent pillar of my family. My younger brother Daniel was always the favorite, the charismatic one, the guy who lit up a room the moment he walked in. Me? I was the numbers guy, the one who stayed late at the office building a logistics company from the ground up. I've always lived modestly. I drive a 10-year-old car that runs perfectly. I prefer well-made clothes without flashy logos. I live in a comfortable home, but nothing extravagant. To the untrained eye, or to someone blinded by appearances, I was just a middle-class man who showed up to family gatherings empty-handed. Daniel, on the other hand, always projected absolute success. Knock-off watches that looked real, tailored suits paid off in installments, a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Until recently, I believed our relationship was solid. I helped pay for his college education. I put down the security deposit on his first apartment when he ran out of money. I never asked for a single dollar back because, to me, family was an investment you didn't expect returns on. I didn't need recognition. I just needed to know he was okay. Then Samantha showed up. She entered his life like a hurricane wrapped in designer labels. She came from a family that once had money, but now only had the last name, and a desperate need to pretend they were still on top. From day one, I noticed the way she looked at me. She scanned me from head to toe, lingering on my worn shoes or my phone that wasn't the newest model. To her, I was a stain on the perfect picture she wanted to paint. Daniel changed. He started talking about status, about networking, about people who matter. Family dinners stopped being about us and became planning sessions for a wedding that, from what I could tell, cost 3 times his annual income. I stayed quiet, watching my brother sink into debt just to satisfy a woman who loved the sparkle of jewelry more than the substance of stability. And yet, when Daniel asked me to be his best man, I felt a pride I rarely allow myself to show. I accepted immediately. I thought that despite Samantha's influence, my brother still remembered who had lifted him up every time he stumbled. I was deeply mistaken. I didn't realize that to them, I was just an accessory that didn't match the decor. The circle they moved in grew more toxic by the month. Samantha hosted gatherings where people talked about European vacations and real estate investments none of them could truly afford. I attended out of loyalty, staying in the shadows, watching their house of cards rise. Daniel would occasionally ask for financial advice and then ignore it. He preferred the fast money schemes of his future father-in-law, a man who survived on appearances and bank loans. I saw the cracks in their foundation, but chose not to interfere beyond what was necessary. Emotionally, I was calm but alert. I believed reality would hit them sooner or later, and I would be there to help pick up the pieces, like I always had. That was my balance, my work, my quiet real estate investments, my role as the dependable older brother. In business, the person with real power is the one who doesn't need to prove it. While they rented luxury cars for social events, I was closing contracts that secured my retirement and my future children's future. But arrogance has a way of blinding people. Samantha and Daniel started believing their own lies. They began to see my discretion as poverty and my silence as lack of ambition. What they didn't know was that while they mocked me at their private dinners, I was expanding my property portfolio, purchasing the commercial spaces where Samantha's father had his offices, and quietly acquiring the debt portfolios from the very banks Daniel relied on. I didn't do it out of malice at first. I did it because it was smart business. My brother and his fiancée were like children playing with fire, and I was simply buying the fire department. But the family dynamic became unbearable. At gatherings, Samantha would interrupt me to explain basic economic concepts or ask, with a condescending smile that chilled my blood, if I could afford the valet parking. Daniel laughed at her jokes, avoiding eye contact with me. I clenched my jaw and kept moving forward. I could have pulled out a bank statement at any moment and shut them both up. But I'm not that kind of man. A smart man doesn't show his cards until the stakes are at their highest. And the stakes rose the night they invited me out to tell me I was no longer welcome at the altar. That was the breaking point, the moment the balance shattered, and my patience ran out. The meeting took place at an outrageously expensive restaurant, the kind where you pay more for the lighting than the food. Daniel looked restless, fidgeting with the ring on his finger, while Samantha sat upright, wearing that familiar expression of superiority I had grown used to. There was no small talk. Samantha placed her hand over my brother's, and without the slightest trace of shame dropped the bomb. She said they had been reviewing the guest list and the ceremony protocol, and my presence as best man simply didn't fit the aesthetic they were going for. She used words like sophistication and prestige, making it clear that my modest image would be embarrassing in front of their new high society friends. Daniel said nothing. He stared at his glass, unable to meet my eyes. When I tried to speak, Samantha cut me off with a sharp gesture. In a tone so cold it froze the air around us, she explained that they needed someone who projected real wealth, someone capable of making a substantial donation to her family's foundation during the reception, and obviously, she added, I wasn't financially equipped for that role. Don't take it personally, Michael, she said, adjusting a gold bracelet that Daniel hadn't even finished paying for. We want the wedding to be a world-class event. Having you up there with your simple suits and low profile makes us look ordinary. We need a best man with a level of status you just don't have. What I felt in that moment wasn't an explosion of anger. It was something colder, like a block of ice forming slowly in my chest. It was calculated humiliation. I looked at Daniel, waiting for him to say something, to defend me, to remember who had carried him when he had nothing. He simply nodded. It's just this once, Mike, he muttered. Samantha's right. The social circle we're stepping into is very demanding. We don't want you to feel out of place around people like that. That betrayal cut deeper than anything she had said. My own brother was calling me insignificant, in front of the woman who was draining his future dry. I stayed silent. I didn't yell. I didn't slam the table. I just watched them. I noticed how Daniel avoided eye contact, and how Samantha savored her small victory. To them, I was a tool they no longer needed. She went on to suggest that maybe I could attend as a regular guest, seated toward the back, so I wouldn't disrupt the symmetry of the main photographs. The contempt was complete. They were stripping me of an honor I had earned through years of sacrifice for this family, all because my bank account didn't scream loudly enough for their deaf ears. I stood up slowly. My chair scraped across the floor, drawing the attention of nearby tables. Samantha looked annoyed, as if my mere movement was inconvenient. I told Daniel not to worry, that I fully understood where I stood in his life. He tried to form a half-hearted apology, but it died in his throat when I placed my hand on his shoulder. I felt him tremble. He knew something had shifted, but he was too intoxicated by his fantasy of status to stop it. I paid the dinner bill, a bill they had no intention of covering, and walked out without looking back. That night, as I walked to my car under a light drizzle, humiliation turned into absolute clarity. They had discarded me for not appearing wealthy enough, when in reality I was the only one who owned their stability. That same week I received an invitation in the mail. I was no longer the best man. Instead, I received a standard secondary guest card, with a note from Samantha specifying a strictly formal dress code, and adding that if I needed help renting an appropriate suit, she could recommend an affordable place. That was the final blow. The loss wasn't just the honor of being best man. I lost the last trace of affection I still held for the idea of family that Daniel represented. I realized my brother had sold his soul for a facade and had used me as a stepping stone until he believed he no longer needed me. But he misunderstood something critical. I wasn't a stepping stone. I was the foundation holding up his castle. By casting me out so cruelly, they freed me from any moral obligation to protect them. I locked my office door that night, sat in front of my computer, and began reviewing documents I had accumulated out of professional habit. I saw the personal loans Daniel had taken out, using a property that, due to a legal technicality he always ignored, was still technically in my name. I saw the overdue invoices from his future father-in-law's company, debts my investment firm had quietly purchased months earlier as part of a strategic expansion. They were surrounded. They had called me poor while living in a house I could seize at any moment. They had called me insignificant, while the very air they breathed financially depended on my signature. That was when my silent anger found its purpose. I would give them the wedding they wanted. But the final gift would be reality knocking on their door. My revenge plan wasn't born from impulse. It was built from cold, deliberate architecture. I'm not a man of emotional outbursts. I'm a man of structure. The day after that humiliating dinner, I called my attorney, Marcus, a man who has managed my assets for decades with the same discretion I apply to my life. We met in my office, far from curious eyes. There was no drama in my voice when I placed the documents on his desk. I asked him to consolidate every debt Daniel and his future father-in-law had taken on over the past 2 years. What we uncovered was worse than I expected. Daniel had forged my signature on a secondary document to secure a bridge loan, money used to finance the reception and Samantha's engagement ring. As for Samantha's father, his commercial properties were mortgaged to the ceiling, and the entity that now owned those mortgages, a subsidiary of my own logistics company, they were all sitting in the palm of my hand. Marcus raised an eyebrow. He knows my protective nature. "Do you want me to give them notice?" he asked. "No," I replied calmly. "I want you to execute the guarantees on the wedding day, not a minute before, not a minute after." In the months that followed, I maintained a facade of complete indifference. I received Daniel's messages complaining about the stress of wedding planning, and I answered with one-word replies, playing the role of the submissive older brother who accepted his place in the back row. Every time Samantha sent out emails with reminders about protocol or instructions that guests were forbidden from taking photos so they wouldn't ruin the exclusive coverage she'd arranged with a local magazine, I smiled. It was the smile of a predator watching prey walk willingly into a trap. I strengthened my legal position carefully. I didn't just want to take their money. I wanted the collapse to be public and clearly caused by their own arrogance. Through my firm, anonymously, I contacted the wedding vendors. I ensured every service, from catering, flowers, live orchestra, was top tier and paid in advance. But the contracts included one key clause. If any legal irregularities involving the contracting parties emerged, services would cease immediately. I was indirectly financing the stage for their own social execution. My patience was absolute. I watched Daniel sell the few remaining shares he had in the family business to buy a watch impressive enough to win over his father-in-law. I watched Samantha spend thousands on a wedding dress that cost more than the annual salary of some of my hardest-working employees. I didn't interfere. I let them accumulate more debt, let them feel more powerful, let them look at me with increasing pity every time we crossed paths. Daniel even had the audacity to ask me for one last loan to cover an unexpected expense with the reception venue. I told him I didn't have liquidity. That business was slow. I watched him walk away with a smirk, convinced I had fallen beneath his level. The final strategic detail was the house. The property Daniel and Samantha planned to move into after their honeymoon was technically granted to him under a conditional use agreement. He believed it was his. Legally, it wasn't. Failure to meet maintenance clauses, combined with his unauthorized use of the property as collateral for personal loans, voided his right of residence. Marcus prepared the eviction order with surgical precision. Everything was ready. Intelligence and patience are far deadlier than raised voices. I didn't need to shout to destroy their lives. I just needed to let the law and the truth do their work at the moment of maximum exposure. As the wedding day approached, I prepared myself mentally. I bought a tailored suit, not to impress them, but to remind myself who I was. The executor. It wasn't flashy, it was dark, impeccable. The kind of suit that radiates power without ever asking for attention. While they rehearsed their vows and dreamed of a fictional life of luxury, I reviewed the legal notifications that would reach them at the exact moment they were celebrating their false status. Revenge is best served cold. But in this case, it would be served on a silver platter, in front of every single witness they had invited to humiliate me. The wedding day rose with a flawless blue sky, the perfect backdrop for the illusion they had built. I arrived early, dressed in my grey Oxford suit, no flashy tie, just the quiet elegance of a man who doesn't need to try too hard. I took my seat in the 10th row, exactly where Samantha had placed me on her seating chart. From there I watched the new best man, a Botox-filled man with a loud last name and louder ego, stand in the spot that, by blood, should have been mine. Daniel looked nervous, but when his eyes met mine, all I saw was pity. He truly believed I was there suffering because of his rejection. The ceremony was a parade of empty opulence, imported flowers, chamber music, promises of eternal love that sounded as fake as half the bank accounts in the room. Samantha walked down the aisle like a queen who had just conquered an empire. What she didn't know was that, at that exact moment, Marcus and a team of court officers were positioned outside the reception hall, waiting for the precise time to deliver the notices. The reception took place in a private club that screamed exclusivity. The important people who had replaced me sipped champagne and discussed investments, while I stood quietly in my corner, watching the clock like an executioner. At 9 p.m., during the toast, Daniel stood up. He grabbed the microphone and thanked his father-in-law for his generosity and for teaching him what true success meant. That was when I saw Marcus walk through the main entrance, flanked by two men in dark suits carrying official folders. There were no immediate screams, just a murmur that spread through the room like spilled oil. They didn't stop at the waitstaff. They went straight to the head table. Samantha went pale when she realized they weren't guests. They were reality. The lead officer handed Daniel the first notice, foreclosure on the house of his dreams, and an immediate eviction order due to fraud in the loan guarantees. Daniel let out a short, nervous laugh, as if it was some kind of joke. It died instantly. The officer then turned to Samantha's father and informed him that his commercial properties had been seized for non-payment, and that my firm was now the legal owner of his assets, my signature, my control. I stood up slowly and walked toward the head table. The silence in the hall was absolute. The only sound was the click of my shoes against the marble floor. Daniel stared at me, face drained of color, clutching the document that stated he would have nowhere to live the next day. "What is this, Michael?" he stammered. Samantha shouted at me to leave and that this was her moment. I looked at her, cold enough to make her step back. "You said I wasn't rich enough to be your best man," I said quietly, so only they could hear. So I decided to be rich enough to own the outcome. The humiliation was complete, cinematic. The high society guests began whispering and stepping away, as if Daniel's financial ruin were contagious. His father-in-law tried to threaten me, but Marcus calmly handed him a breakdown of the personal debts I had acquired. They were finished. The orchestra stopped playing, exactly as outlined in the contracts I had supervised. Waiters began collecting unopened wine bottles. The world-class event collapsed in real time. I watched it all with a calm that almost frightened me. Daniel begged me right there, in front of his new wife, to stop the process. "You're my brother," he said, tears in his eyes. I looked at him without emotion. "That brother stayed in the restaurant where you decided my dignity didn't fit your pictures," I replied. Samantha began sobbing, her $1,000 dress now just fabric absorbing the ashes of her ambition. There was no forgiveness scene, no final embrace. I turned and walked toward the exit, leaving behind the chaos their arrogance had created. As I stepped outside the club, I heard Samantha screaming at Daniel, blaming him for everything. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just the silence that remains when the lies run out of money to stand on. Several months have passed since that night, and the dust has finally settled over the ruins of what they once called their life. Daniel and Samantha never made it to a honeymoon in the Greek islands. Instead, they spent those weeks in a small rental apartment, surrounded by moving boxes and legal bills they couldn't afford to pay. My brother tried calling me dozens of times. His messages shifted from pleading to anger to desperation. I didn't answer a single one. I blocked his number, not out of hatred but out of absolute indifference. To me, they stopped existing the moment they put a price tag on my presence in their lives. Samantha's father lost his office, and most of his reputation along with it. In the very social circles they fought so hard to enter, they're now the cautionary tale, the example of what happens when you try to build an empire on sand and borrowed money. I don't take pleasure in their suffering, but I do feel something else, satisfaction. Because balance has been restored, reality collects its debts with interest, and they owed far too much. People often confuse kindness with weakness. They mistake discretion for lack of power. That was their greatest mistake with me. I continue living my life the same way I always have. I wake up early. I go to my office. I keep building my wealth with the same patience I used to plan their collapse. The only difference now is that my dining table is quieter during the holidays, and that's fine. I prefer solitude over the company of people who only value what shines on the surface. I've learned that family isn't a blood bond that gives you permission to step on someone. It's a contract of mutual respect, and they were the ones who broke it, for the sake of vanity. There are no happy endings here, only fair ones. Daniel discovered that the woman he betrayed his brother for isn't nearly as charming when there are no unlimited credit cards. And Samantha learned that the last name she bragged about doesn't pay the rent. Life isn't a movie where everyone hugs at the end. Life is a ledger, and theirs closed permanently in the red. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's watching life collect what it's owed. If this story felt as intense to you as it was for me to live it, hit like and tell me in the comments what you would have done. And if you're not subscribed yet, turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story.